This podcast contains graphic descriptions of death and decay. Please listen with care.
Campsite Media.
Walker County, Georgia, and Noble, they're places where people and families are entangled, where if a store closes, your neighbor might be the one to reopen it, where your high school teacher knows you before you actually sit at a desk in their classroom, because they also taught your parents and your cousins. So imagine how it was when the bodies were discovered at Tri-State Crematory. It must have been impossible for the families to go to the grocery store, or the bank, or the Dairy Dip diner, without someone asking them how they were doing, and reminding them again about the horrible thing that had happened. But some families, the lucky ones, do eventually get some relief. Like Sheila Mannis, the independent, loyal wife of Ira Mannis, who died in August 2000. Sheila loved her husband so much that she unwrapped Hershey Kisses for him before his hunting trips. In September 2002, 7 months after the bodies were discovered, Sheila learns that Ira's body has been found.
I was just laughing, and I was just so glad that they had found him, because I had no idea what I would have done if I had not got a body. I couldn't have lived with that, I don't think.
You had immediate elation.
Yes.
Immediate happiness.
Just thank God, there's an end for me,
Ira's body is first identified through DNA samples taken from Sheila's daughter, and with the help of some of Ira's old x-rays. Sheila calls Special Agent Greg Ramey to thank him, and he tells her a little bit more about the condition of Ira's remains. It's not pretty.
Brent had put a tarp over him. He was outside. And at some point in time, the animals had kind of dragged that tarp kind of half off of him. So he was partially mummified, and then the other side was skeleton. Most of his body parts were there, but he was missing his right arm.
So when Greg tells Sheila that they found Ira, what he really means is that they found most of Ira. They don't know what happened to the missing arm. Ira wasn't buried or in a vault. Since he, or most of him, was found outside, among a bunch of other bodies, his right arm could have gotten mixed up with another set of remains. Now Sheila has to decide what to do with Ira's newfound body. Some of the other families who have gotten bodies decide against cremation this time around. They bury them instead. But Sheila wants to stick with the plan that Ira so meticulously prepared for himself and asked her to carry out. She's going to have him cremated, for real this time. A funeral home near Sheila, not the one she originally used, offers free cremations for bodies recovered at Tri-State. So Sheila asked them to pick up Ira from the temporary morgue near the Walker County Civic Center. She's filed a lawsuit against the original funeral home that sent Ira's body to Tri-State. The attorneys want to get a DNA sample from Ira's body to confirm the remains are actually him. So Sheila invites the representatives of the people she's suing to poke and prod at her dead husband before he's cremated. It turns the funeral home into a bit of a scene. There are lawyers and forensic experts and reporters there, and it's all going smoothly until McCracken Poston, Brent Marsh's attorney, decides to show up.
Because I knew I was about to be trying a case, potentially, where these issues of how the DNA was extracted was going to come up.
Sheila sees McCracken pull up to the funeral home in what she describes as his little Mercedes. Funeral home lawyers are one thing, but no way in hell does she want the jerk defending Brent Marsh there when she views Ira's body. She tells her lawyer, "Get Poston out of here."
He gets out, and he's taking his jacket off, and by this time I'm halfway to him, and my attorney catches up with me, and he stops and says, "This is what you're paying me for, I'm supposed to fight your battles."
Sheila's lawyer stops McCracken and tells him that Sheila doesn't want him around for this.
And I got it. I said, "Man, don't worry. My role here is not that critical." And I, deferred to the widow's wishes.
So McCracken leaves without a fuss. Sheila and her daughter view Ira's partially mummified remains. From the pictures I've seen, the remains look closer to a pile of bones and dirt than a human body. But Sheila was married to the man for 20 years, and she finds ways to recognize Ira. She sees a familiar plaid pattern from his boxer shorts among the bones. and that old dental appliance that Ira wore. There's no doubt it's Ira, or most of Ira anyway. The lawyers get the DNA sample they want, and Sheila gets one last look at her husband's remains before he's put into the furnace and burned. Knowing that Ira is finally being cremated brings Sheila some relief, but seeing his half-mummified corpse also sharpens her anger towards Brent. Now she knows for sure that Ira's body was mistreated, kept outside for a year like an old car, and any joy she feels over her own closure is tempered by the knowledge that other families are still waiting, hoping, praying for their own positive identifications. Later that night, while Sheila is still at the funeral home, she gets a call from a friend. He says that McCracken wants to talk.
I said, no, I won't call him. I said, what does he want? Well, he's wanting to apologize to you. He didn't know it'd be that upsetting. I said, are you serious? And he said, yeah. And I had his number, and I thought, no.
But then Sheila takes a beat. She thinks that showboat lawyer McCracken is calling me after midnight to apologize. Normally he'd do it on TV or in the newspaper so that everybody can hear him. He wouldn't do it in private. So maybe he's being sincere this time. Maybe he's really sorry about showing up at the funeral home. And Sheila calls him back.
Once you get to know Sheila, she's extremely plain-spoken. She is going to tell you how she feels, and then it's over for her. And she called me, and we had a very frank discussion about Ira, and learned about his life, and I listened to her.
He said, yes. He said, I'm really sorry. He said, I'm just doing what I got to do. And he said, but I think I found a formidable opponent. I said, yeah, I think you have. And I said, tell me about Brent. And he said, well, I'm not supposed to. I said, I'm just asking you, will you tell me about Brent?
McCracken tells Sheila some things about Brent that haven't been getting much attention on the evening news. About how close Brent is with his family. About his football career at UT Chattanooga. How he's the son of a school teacher, Clara, and that his elderly father had a stroke. And this conversation with McCracken, the hotshot lawyer, plants a seed in Sheila's mind. All this time she's hated Brent, thought he deserved harsh punishment for what he'd done. But the call with McCracken gets her wondering if she's been fair. If Brent really deserves life in prison. If he's really what she's been calling him on the online forums. If Brent Marsh is really a monster after all. From Waveland and Campside Media, this is Noble. I'm Shaun Raviv. Episode 7, The Missing Right Arm. As Brent Marsh's trial approaches, his attorney, McCracken Poston, does everything he can to put pressure on Walker County prosecutors. In pretrial motions and hearings, McCracken argues that a human body cannot be property. He cites a case from 1905. A widow in Georgia sued the Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company for $2,000 for desecrating her husband's corpse. The railroad had been paid to transport the body to where it was going to be buried, but during a changeover from one train to another, they left the body out in the rain for hours.
And so they gave the quasi-tort right to the widow because she saw the body being damaged and messed her head up and all that stuff watching it. But the opinion was beautiful because it described how can we evaluate a rotting corpse. It's not like pig iron or other commodities. It's changing too. It's becoming less and less as time goes on.
The judge in that case wrote in his opinion, "A corpse in some respects is the strangest thing on earth. A man who but yesterday breathed and thought and walked among us has passed away. Something has gone. The body is left still and cold, and is all that is visible to mortal eye of the man we knew. It is not surprising that the law relating to this mystery of what death leaves behind cannot be precisely brought within the letter of all the rules regarding corn, lumber, and pig iron." Based on that old case, McCracken's team argues that Georgia law says a body holds no monetary value, and that the bereaved have no right to possess a body. A body cannot be owned in Georgia, they argue, and therefore Brent has not committed theft. On top of this, McCracken is doing his damnedest to increase the cost of a trial. He's already convinced the judge to bring in a jury from outside of Walker County, which will have to house and feed the jurors. And at one point, McCracken tells the county administrator that the trial is going to be really expensive for the county. He tells him, "Don't you maybe want to tell the prosecutor that taking this case to trial isn't such a good idea?"
And I was prodding him, please go talk to him, because I'm just going to dig in, and you're going to have to identify everybody. And I'm going to cross-examine that witness as to everybody. So this thing looked like it was going to take months to try.
Eventually, McCracken thinks he's done enough to compel the prosecutor to negotiate a plea deal and avoid a trial. And that's his goal, even if it's not necessarily what McCracken wants. It's what his client wants.
Brent was the one that put the brakes on. I would have loved to have tried the case. I would have loved to be in a 3-month-long trial, because I think they would be so frustrated.
The prosecutor starts negotiating. McCracken likes to point out that originally Brent was facing a sentence of 8,000 years, 4 times since the death of Jesus. Now he's trying to get the DA to go down to single digits.
Brent, he just said, do it when we got to the number 12. Do it. I don't want to put my family through anymore.
A lot of time has passed at this point. It's been over 2 years since the bodies were discovered. But after some wrangling, McCracken and the DA agreed to a deal. Brent will plead guilty to 787 counts, including 122 counts of burial service fraud and 179 counts of abuse of a corpse. In exchange, he'll get a 12-year sentence. But the sentence is only one part of Brent's punishment, and time in prison is only one part of what the families want. A lot of them think he's getting off way too easy. Even those who are satisfied with the deal still want answers from him and why he did this. And they finally think they're going to get those answers in November 2004, when Brent pleads guilty in court, and he speaks. To those individuals who were genuinely harmed emotionally as a result of my actions, I apologize, Brent says during the hearing. But he says that he can't give the families in the courtroom the answers that they want. He says, quote, "not for lack of a desire to give those answers." Sheila Manis is there to hear Brent, and his speech runs through her mind as she drives away from the plea hearing.
My son was home when I got home. I went back in his bedroom and I sat down. I said, "Can I talk to you a minute, Matt?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "If I asked you to do something for me, would you do it?" And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Anything. If I asked you to kill somebody for me, would you kill somebody for me?" He said, "You're my mama, yeah." That's all I need to hear.
The talk with her son, and him telling Sheila that he'd do anything for her, even kill someone, confirms a theory she's been developing in her own mind, which is Brent took over Tri-State Crematory, not because he wanted to, but because he's a good son. She believes that Brent didn't want anything to do with the crematory, but when his father got sick, he agreed to take it over out of a sense of duty to his family, and to his mother specifically. Then, when Brent found himself in charge, he couldn't keep up, couldn't handle the difficult job of cremating bodies, but he also couldn't admit he'd fallen behind.
He loved his mother. They were a close family. And same situation. Matt's dad was gone, and it was up to me to handle everything. So yes, my son would have done anything for me.
So you had gone through somewhat of a similar thing as Brent. Brent's father was sick for a long time. Mm-hmm. He and his mother helped take care of him.
The mother was left holding it, and she couldn't do it, so she had to ask him if he would do it. And being the good, obedient son, he done it.
Just like you and your kids had to step up when Ira died.
Yes.
Sheila sees clear parallels between her family and the Marsh family, and she begins to regret the mean things she said about the Marshes in the online forums.
It's kind of a jolt back into my reality that, I'm a Christian, and I wasn't acting like one. And it wasn't helping my kids, me going around ranting and carrying on all the time about Brent and all this stuff.
And so Sheila calls up McCracken again.
I asked him, I said, what can I do to help? And he said, what do you mean? I said, what can I do to help Brent? He said, are you serious? I said, do I lie? He said, no. And he said, well, let me see, and I'll get back with you.
The judge still has to decide if he'll accept the 12-year plea deal agreed upon by McCracken and the prosecutors. They'll hold a hearing where the families, the victims of Tri-State, will have an opportunity to speak in court. Brent will be there, and McCracken expects he'll face some harsh words. He asks Sheila if she's willing to speak at the hearing. But so far, Sheila has had a change of heart only in private. She hasn't spoken about it on the forums, much less in public. She has to decide if she can take her new and true internal feelings about Brent and say them out loud, in front of the very people who hate him most.
Good morning, everyone. I'm getting organized here, and then I want to speak to you briefly. My name is Jim Bodiford, and it's been almost 3 years where I was specially appointed to handle this case.
It's the morning of January 31st, 2005, and Judge Jim Bodiford begins a hearing at the Walker County Courthouse in a big, echoey room with high ceilings.
If anyone wants to speak, they are permitted to speak.
Sheila Manis has found her seat, along with dozens of others in the back of the courtroom. Across from Sheila, she sees the other victims sitting together in the jury box, wearing yellow memory ribbons on their chests. She sees Special Agent Greg Ramey sitting with the prosecutors in a wood-backed chair right by the jury box, as if to show the families he's still with them all this time later.
Both the state and the defense have entered into a negotiated plea, which is pretty common.
Clara Marsh is a row back, and on the other side of the courtroom, on the defense's side, which is pretty empty in comparison. She wears a white church hat with a flower on the side and holds a huge Bible on her lap. At one point, a news camera catches Clara reading what looks like a highlighted section of Isaiah 53, a chapter that foretells the life and death of Christ. Her son, Brent Marsh, in a gray suit, sits next to McCracken Poston at the defense table, their backs to the spectators.
The final word belongs to the judge. After the plea is submitted, the judge can reject it. It doesn't happen very often.
Light slants in through the large windows behind Judge Bodiford as he explains that the family members can give their opinions for or against the deal. And if he doesn't approve it, then the case could still go to trial. Bodiford has also read the nearly 250 statements that were already submitted in writing.
I know that many of you have trouble sleeping. That was probably the number one thing you told me. Many of you have nightmares. Many of you lose your temper easily. Many of you, unfortunately, have had bouts of depression. Many of you are anxious, have anxiety attacks.
And Judge Bodiford keeps reading from this list. Problems focusing, general distrust of people, isolation, troubles at work and with family, marital issues, and a big one, guilt, about what happened to their relative's body, which was entrusted to them, something that Sheila has been dealing with for a long time now. Bodiford turns the floor over to the families.
Julie Kinder,
They're called to the witness stand one by one.
you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Please be seated, Ms. Kinder. Speak up where the judge can hear you, okay?
Everyone has their own unique story to tell, and their own unique reaction to what happened to their relatives. One man gets in the stand and shows a picture of his wife's corpse. Another shows a painting of her sister's urn. Some of the victims who speak are clearly still angry 3 years later, like Julie Gosnell Kinder, whose father was Robert Gosnell.
Well, Mr. Marsh, how many felonies did you commit? How many times did you break the law? Perform a gruesome act? This man needs to be punished. He has caused me extreme emotional pain. I walk around with the stress and anxiety burning in my stomach. I grieve over and over for the gruesome treatment of my father. You're a sicko, in my opinion. And Judge Botiford, please give him the maximal penalty you have at your discretion. Thank you.
Some of the most intense words come from people with personal connections to Brent or the Marsh family. Adrian Brock was a high school football referee, and Brent was a regular customer at the store where he worked. Brock's younger brother Van was sent to Tri-State in 1999.
I was proud of how you did your football career, but when this happened, if this was a football game, I would have had to throw you out. This has had a tremendous effect on me and my family. It has had a real effect on my nerves. And my brother, he died in my arms and his wife's arms. And 2.5 years later, I'm looking at a skeleton, and it hurts, Brent. And I'm so disappointed in you.
Natasha Mann's father, Johnny Dykes, was taken to Tri-State in October 2001. Natasha had economics class with Brent, and her parents knew Ray and Clara Marsh. Her dad actually visited the crematory and watched Ray work. So when he died, her family felt comfortable sending his body to Tri-State. Natasha looks right at Brent as she speaks.
Brent, I don't know what your problem is or was, but it didn't take a lot of brain cells. I keep asking myself, why and how could you have done this to my daddy? The answers that I come up with turn my stomach. You have told us that you cannot tell us why you did this horrific crime. And I guess, unfortunately, we have to live with that. I have come to learn through this process that you will meet your maker one day. And excuse me, but all the hell you've put us through will come back to you twofold. I see nothing when I look at you. You have hardened me in ways that I could never begin to explain. You may not have killed my father, but a part of us died when you put my father's body in a vault with 20 others. I love my daddy with all my heart, and no matter what you have put us through, you could never change that. Life in prison would be just right for you.
Throughout all of this, sitting at the defense table, Brent is stoic. He doesn't turn his head away from the people speaking at the witness stand. He appears to be looking directly at them. It could be that Brent's sympathetic to their pain and wants to dignify their words by giving them his full attention. Or it could be that that's what his lawyer told him to do. I don't know. Sheila Manis has been waiting to be called to the stand to say her piece. She knows there could be consequences for saying the words she wrote down. She knows that people in this courtroom will turn away from her, maybe even hate her. But she also knows it's the right thing to do. And then the bailiff calls Sheila's name.
Miss Manis, where are you from, ma'am?
Chatsworth, Georgia.
And what deceased are you connected with in this case?
My husband, Ira Manis III.
Okay. Ma'am, if you would, please tell the court how this crime has affected you and any other matters that you want to discuss with the court.
Well, there's been a wide range of emotions, but I do have a statement that I would like to read.
Sheila's wearing a black low-cut suit and a black jacket. Her hair is dark and goes past her shoulders, and she wears big, dangling earrings. If she only had a veil, she could be dressed for a stylish funeral. She reads from a printed sheet and looks at Brent on and off as she talks about Ira, how handsome he was, how he died, how angry and shocked she was when she found out about Tri-State, how guilty she felt.
I kept waiting for this so-called closure, but it never came. I was full of hate and anger, and I had no direction to aim it at. Then finally the day came that I realized that I would never find it as long as I was full of the hate and anger. So I had to let that go. And
Sheila talks about that earlier plea hearing, when she heard Brent apologize for all that happened, and how after that she went home and discussed it with her children.
And Brent, I want you to know that my family and I accept your apology. The most wonderful thing about being a mother is the fact that they love their children unconditionally. Even though they don't condone what their children do, they will always love them. And I also think you're a very brave man to sit here and accept the punishment set forth by this judge. I think we've all been punished enough, and I include you in that statement. If it were up to me, you'd go home today. But I don't have the power to do that.
You can't hear it well in the recording, but when she says that she'd like to see Brent go free, people in the courtroom start making noise, grumbling about what Sheila is saying. The judge cuts them off.
Now, let's respect. I want you to do this. Let's respect everybody's opinion. There are going to be many, many opinions here today, and you don't have to agree with them. But let's respect them. We're in a court of law. Let's please do that. Thank you.
Thank you. The only thing I can offer you at this time, Brent, is my forgiveness and best wishes. And please know that not all of us want you to die in prison. And I will never oppose your release on parole. And if there is anything I can do, I'm willing to do it. Thank you.
When Sheila goes home after the hearing, there are TV trucks outside her house. She unplugs her phone from the wall, sends her kids to their friends, and leaves town for a week. Sheila's evolution from leader of the Brent Marsh hate club to his advocate is pretty shocking. Other victims eventually forgive Brent, but few make such a complete U-turn as Sheila. It really does make her an outlier in the community at the time. I still, to this day, am not sure how she managed the transformation. Maybe it was the shock of Ira's death and his post-death adventure that triggered it. Or maybe, like McCracken said, she has a rare ability to see outside of herself. Over the years, Sheila finds peace. With Ira, with what happened to his body. By the time I meet her in 2023, she's lost a daughter, and she's fighting a debilitating disease of her own. She shows me a memory book that she's kept all these years. It holds Ira's awards, certificates, accomplishments. It's also got love letters he wrote to her when he was dying, news clippings from all the crematory stuff. It has pictures of Ira when he was alive and dead.
Death's part of life, you know, and you can't run from it. And if I took all the bad things that I've been through, I would just be miserable and wallowing in pity, and I'm too independent and educated to do that.
Sheila is also still at peace with Brent. At one point, they even wrote letters to each other. Sheila can now laugh about what happened at Tri-State, to Ira, to her and her family. She can even laugh about the one final twist in the saga of Ira's body. In January 2003, 4 months after Ira was identified and cremated for real, Sheila got a call from Greg Ramey. He had 2 words for her. Ira's back. They'd found Ira's missing right arm, a mile away from the body. Animals must have dragged it away. The coroner gave Sheila the arm in a large manila envelope. She had Ira's arm cremated, and she keeps the ashes in a box in her living room, mixed with ashes of her deceased daughter. And when she dies, Sheila's ashes will go in there too, commingled with her family. After the hearing, Judge Bodiford approves the plea deal. Brent will get 12 years. Bodiford tells the families he's not going to make Brent explain why he did what he did, but he hopes that Brent will find it in his heart to do so. The families seem desperate to know. But Brent goes to prison without ever explaining publicly why he didn't burn the bodies, why he put bodies in vaults, why he buried bodies in mass graves, why he gave families fake cremains, why he would or could do something so obviously wrong. Noble, Walker County, the families, as time passes, they keep asking this question. And 2 years after the hearing, McCracken gives them an answer. In February 2007, with Brent Marsh in prison, a couple years into his 12-year sentence, McCracken Poston issues a 9-page press release to the media.
I did it on the 5-year anniversary of the discoveries. And the reason I did was everybody kept saying, we never found out why. And it just seemed like a bit of anger behind that. We never found out. We weren't given the reason why this happened. And I thought, well, here, I'll give you the reason. I'll give you what was going to be the defense.
In the press release, McCracken writes that people still come up to him, unsolicited, and offer their theories for why it happened. The most difficult to tolerate, he writes, are ignorantly conceived opinions involving racism or misguided and inaccurate conspiracy theories. I realize now, he writes, that the need for a plausible explanation is what has invited the rank speculation. At this point, McCracken has been working on the Tri-State case for half a decade. He's gotten paid some. In fact, one of his payments from the Marshes comes in the form of a commercial property they own, the piece of land in Noble where Ray Marsh once owned a general store, and where Stan Porter once owned a barbecue restaurant. But overall, McCracken hasn't gotten anywhere near the amount an attorney would normally get paid for working on a case that long. He just seems to really like Brent and Clara and the Marsh family, and he thinks the press release might have a positive effect on Brent's eventual parole hearing. The title of the release, in all caps, is A Scientific Explanation for the Events at Tri-State Crematory. When he first took on the case, McCracken explored any possible theories to explain what he calls Brent's bizarre behavior. Investigators ruled out necrophilia or any other abuses of the bodies, outside of leaving them to rot. And he didn't save a ton of money by not burning the bodies. So why did Brent do it? McCracken saw Brent as, quote, the most unlikely person to have deceived so many people. And, McCracken writes, he was led to believe that Brent was suffering from some kind of neurological disorder. During my many talks with McCracken, when I asked him about Brent's emotional state in the days after the discovery, he always described Brent as being in a fog.
You know, he was in a fog. He was, to me, in a fog. He was operating in a fog for some time.
He told me that Brent seemed bewildered. To get a second opinion on this, McCracken asked the one person who might be able to explain Brent's foggy state, Brent's wife. His wife told McCracken that indeed, something had been off with Brent.
She said he really suffers from insomnia the last, couple of years or something like that. Just for as long as she had known him, he seemed to have this insomnia problem.
Brent's wife also told McCracken that Brent had frequent headaches and body aches. And of course, Brent's father, Ray, had multiple strokes, neuropathy, senility, and Parkinson's-like symptoms. That's all before Ray died in May 2003. McCracken asked Brent what it was like when a body was burned in the Tri-State furnace. And Brent told him the crematory building filled up with smoke.
This machine was in fairly bad shape in terms of ventilation. The stovepipe coming out of it, leading to the outside of the building, was compromised. It was thinned out, rusted, and missing in big parts. So when they would burn a body, dust and vapors fill that building up. And here's two men in there breathing that in. One man for a long time, and then another one comes in and helps him, and then the older one leaves, and the other one is there still breathing it in.
McCracken became convinced that Brent and Ray had suffered from mercury poisoning, which could theoretically have caused their symptoms. Brent didn't just ignore every body that he took in. It's believed that he burned approximately 660 bodies over his 5 years. And all those bodies he burned, a lot of them had dental fillings made partially of mercury. And if you burned the fillings and inhaled the smoke, you'd be inhaling elemental mercury, which is not good. So McCracken started reading academic articles about mercury toxicity, dental amalgams, mercury-tainted fish, and the mercury-associated set of symptoms famously known as Mad Hatter's disease. And in 2004, McCracken had some of Brent's hairs tested for heavy metals. The results showed that Brent had elevated levels of aluminum, antimony, arsenic, cadmium, lead, nickel, and tin, all of which together could be a sign of mercury poisoning. Simply put, McCracken's argument is that Brent's brain wasn't functioning properly when he was running the crematory. And the extension of that explanation is that Brent wasn't fully responsible for what happened at Tri-State, because he was mentally impaired.
Brent could never articulate why this happened. And I believe him. I believe that he was in a fog. And I think the mercury poisoning was the reason. Or the effect of toxicity of mercury on his brain was the reason.
Would it be accurate to say that it seemed like to you that Brent Marsh, throughout the case, while you were working with him closely, that it felt like he was in a fog the entire time?
No, not at all. He cleared up. He cleared up.
It certainly seems plausible to me that both Ray and Brent were exposed to mercury, and who knows what other chemical fumes, when the furnace was so porous. And exposure to mercury is a known hazard for people working in the cremation business. But I spoke with an expert who told me that elevated levels of metals, like Brent's hair test showed, are not a good substitute for clear, direct evidence of mercury exposure. Ray and Brent's symptoms could have been caused by a million things. A lot of people have strokes and get dementia for reasons other than mercury poisoning. And Brent's fogginess? Who wouldn't seem like they're in a fog after going from a seemingly normal guy in a tiny town like Noble to being arrested and put on international news overnight? I personally don't buy the mercury poisoning theory because I just don't think it's been proven. And frankly, neither does McCracken. He ends his 2007 press release with the word opinion. He says, "It is an opinion based in science that I stand by and am confident will not be contradicted. I ask that any and all in the community consider these facts before making their own final judgment about Brent Marsh and the events at Tri-State Crematory. If a better explanation is to be had, it is simply not to be found." Over all this time I've spent learning about Tri-State, I've loved talking with McCracken, texting with him day in and day out, laughing with him, begging him for documents, contacts, and his memories. But I think there is a better explanation about what happened at Tri-State. And after more than a year of reporting, I figured out where to find it.
I know why it happened, when it happened. I know exactly where all the bodies were. I know exactly what he did. I know everything that he did, and I know the reasons why.
That's on the next and final episode of Noble. Noble is a production of Waveland and Campside Media. Noble was reported and written by Johnny Kaufman and me, Shaun Revive. Johnny Kaufman is our senior producer. Sierra Franco is our associate producer. Editing by Jason Hoke, Johnny Kaufman, and Matt Scher. Fact-checking by Kaylin Lynch. Sound design, mixing, scoring, and original music by Garrett Tiedemann. Our theme music is La Lucha es una sola by the band Esmerine. Campside Media's operations team is Doug Slaywin, David Eichler, Ashley Warren, Destiny Dingle, and Sabina Mara. Jason Hoke is the executive producer at Waveland. The executive producers at Campside Media are Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, Adam Hoff, and Matt Scher. This podcast contains graphic descriptions of death and decay. Please listen with care.
Campside Media.
Roughly 5 seconds after the news about Tri-State hit the airwaves back in 2002, every lawyer within spitting distance of Noble began recruiting clients. Some attorneys put out newspaper ads, and one law firm creates a website just to lure in families who were victims of Tri-State Crematory. A flurry of lawsuits follows, against the funeral homes and Brent Marsh and his family. Luckily, the Marshes have a homeowner's policy with Georgia Farm Bureau Insurance, and the company ends up providing them with representation for the civil cases. That's how a tall and lanky lawyer named Stuart James gets involved. A guy from the insurance company calls Stuart to ask if he'll help defend the family.
And he said, "I got a bunch of lawsuits for you." And I said, "Really?" He said, "I got about, I think it was like 115. And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, you know about that guy who had the dead bodies on the property?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, we insure him." And I said, "Really?" So I went down to Georgia and I picked up 115 lawsuits.
In total, the Marshes and the funeral homes Brent worked with faced more than 250 civil suits in 3 states, Combined, they're looking at more than $100 million in potential damages. Most of the remaining cases are consolidated into a single class action suit seeking millions of dollars, and some of the funeral homes settle on their own. Amidst all this litigation, Stewart meets with Brent. This isn't one of their regular lawyer-client visits. Stewart wants to get the full story from Brent, to learn exactly what happened at Tri-State. The civil suits could go on a long time, and people get old and die. He wants to make sure the story exists somewhere on paper, even if that paper is then put into a safe and locked away.
So I went to the jail, and I went in there, and I sat in a little visiting room with him for a couple of hours and went over everything detail by detail. And he understood that I was making a record, and I made a record of it that I could use at a later time, you know?
You wrote it all down, in other words?
I did write it all down.
Was it an important moment for Brent then? Was it like a final confession getting off his chest, or was it already off his chest?
No, it was, he and I were sitting there talking about what happened. And he knew, Brent's a smart guy. He knew I was doing it because I'm a lawyer. Not his friend, it was his lawyer. I said, this is because I'm preserving the record. He understood that. He understood exactly what was going on. And he just told me everything. I know why it happened, when it happened. I know exactly where all the bodies were. I know exactly what he did. I know everything that he did. And I know the reasons why.
When I speak with Stewart, I'm hoping he'll connect me to Brent, who has never gone on the record with any reporter. I want to interview Brent because I want to know what was going on in his head when he ran the crematory. I want to know why he did all this, why this all happened in the first place. And I know the families do too. And after a year of working on this story and learning everything I can about him, except what it's like to be in the same room, I will finally meet Brent Marsh. From Waveland and Campside Media, this is Noble. I'm Shaun Raviv. Episode 8, The Pastor. As part of his plea deal in the criminal case, Brent has to send a handwritten letter of apology to a designated relative of each body that was found and identified at Tri-State. He writes more than 200 versions of this. Dear Mrs. Smith, I am so sorry for your loss. I wish I had the answers to give you that would put your mind at ease, but I do not. I can only offer you my deepest apology. Someday, I pray that you will be able to forgive me for my failure to properly perform my job. Also, I pray you will be able to put an end to this chapter of your life. Please accept my sincerest apologies and my prayers for you. Prayerfully yours, Brent Marsh. To start serving his 12 years, Brent is taken to a prison close to the Georgia coast, a 5.5-hour drive from the Appalachian hills of Noble. Here's his civil defense attorney, Stewart James.
Brent was considered a high-risk prisoner because he was so high profile. When he was originally in prison, he was in a facility where cops and high-risk prisoners were being there. He was a really good prisoner, and he wanted to go work and be a volunteer member at the fire department up the street. Normally, they would have allowed him to do that, but because of who he was, they did not.
But Brent finds a lot of other things to do.
He got more education in prison than anybody I know.
That's Brent's criminal defense attorney, McCracken Poston.
But I guess if you're doing 12 years, you do that. I think he learned how to be a barber. He finished a theological degree. I was quite proud of him because he didn't sit idly. He was very well liked. He did a lot of work in prison. He was very reliable. No disciplinary record, that kind of thing, which is remarkable.
In Georgia, it's common for an offender to be released early if they don't cause any problems. And Brent is a model prisoner, according to McCracken. But he's never granted parole. Later in his sentence, Brent is transferred to a facility a bit closer to Noble, so it's easier for his family to visit. That family includes a daughter. Incredibly, she was born 2 weeks before the bodies were discovered. As this little girl was first encountering the world, her father was being arrested and put on the cover of newspapers across the country. Stewart James again.
I think the most painful aspect for him going to prison was that He couldn't be a daily part of the raising his daughter, but he was even dedicated from prison to make sure that everything was done for her benefit. Make sure that she was visited him, made sure he wrote her letters, make sure that he supported any decision his wife was making in terms of her education, make sure that his mother was involved with her life, and make sure that, I think the most important thing is that regardless of what he did or did not do, he loved her, and that love was unconditional. He's a great father.
Brent's daughter is a teenager when he gets out of prison in June of 2016, 14 years after the bodies were first discovered. McCracken picks him up. Local news reporters are there, and they follow McCracken's black pickup all the way to Noble. They want to get Brent to say a few words, but he stands silent as McCracken speaks on his behalf. McCracken tells the reporters that it's time to forgive Brent Marsh, to welcome him back to the community. He says, "I just want people to leave him alone and give him a chance." I'm as guilty as anyone of not leaving Brent Marsh alone. I suspect that if he was given the choice, he'd prefer I never make this podcast, that Tri-State Crematory and everything he did and didn't do was forgotten forever. And I've wondered myself, is it wrong to put more attention on Brent, someone who has been portrayed as a sicko and a monster, but who has done his time and is now trying to get past it? But I also know that his actions affected a lot of other people, not just Brent. And I don't think he's monstrous. Far from it. So I stay in touch with Brent's lawyers, Stewart and McCracken, and repeatedly, nicely, ask for an interview. The idea is to present Brent as a human being, whatever kind of human he is. I tell Stewart and McCracken that if listeners can hear Brent's voice, they'll hear the goodness so many people say is there. And maybe along the way, Brent can tell me what really happened. But for months, there's no sign that I'll get an interview. After Brent gets out of prison, he gets a job at a warehouse and is quickly promoted. He also gets a commercial driver's license and runs a transportation company for a while. He again starts giving back to the community. He works for the United Way and a Baptist Pastors Association. And Brent Marsh actually volunteers for FEMA, one of the agencies that came to Noble to help with cleanup at Tri-State. By the time I first reach out to him, he seems to have worked his way back to a pretty normal life. I can only hope that McCracken will somehow convince Brent to talk to me, even though I'm not sure McCracken wants him to. In the meantime, I investigate the question of why without Brent, why he did what he did, and I return to a familiar source, someone who's spent more time in this case than anybody. Even after everyone else leaves Noble and returns to the regular beats, Special Agent Greg Ramey of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI, keeps working the crematory case. There are still bodies lingering, unidentified, and Greg doesn't like leaving cases unresolved. Walker County is his home. This all happened just a quick drive from his house, and Greg is continually reminded that not all the families can move on.
There was a little old lady that, bless her heart, she called up, seemed like every day, you know. They didn't have any children. There was no other folks in their family, just these two little folks, just a sweetheart little couple. The gentleman died, and this little lady called every day. If I didn't hear from her every day, I heard from her once a week. Hon, this is so-and-so. Have you found my husband? I said, no, ma'am. Sorry, we haven't.
Eventually, after a couple years, the old woman stops calling, and Greg just assumes she died. Her husband's body is never found. The final body count that the newspapers use is 339, but that's really just an estimate, probably an overcount, according to Greg. A lot of the remains in the Marsh family's property are so decayed, mangled, and commingled that the number of bodies found just can't be exact. Parts of one body get mixed with parts of another, especially smaller bones, like from the hands and feet. 2 bodies even get switched altogether, given to the wrong families. But Greg eventually sorts it out. The number of bodies identified is a bit more precise. With all the millions of dollars spent in Walker County by all the different agencies who got involved, to this day, only 226 of the bodies have been identified. And some people think even that number is off by 1 or 2. Overall, Greg is proud of his work on the case. but he still has regrets.
I felt like we did a phenomenal job, other than, in my heart, I wish we could have identified all of those bodies. That would have been my ultimate goal in it. It didn't happen.
Once they stop IDing bodies, there's another thing to deal with. The roughly 100 unidentified and unclaimed sets of human remains. What do you do with 100 bodies with no names? In March 2004, they're buried in separate unmarked graves at a cemetery on a hill in Walker County. The state later spends tens of thousands of dollars to put a memorial in that same spot. The engraved marker includes a passage from Ecclesiastes and a poem about healing. And at the edge of the same cemetery, there are a few unlabeled mausoleums. They're filled with 178 sets of ashes that families abandoned. They sent them in to be tested and never picked them up. I guess those families didn't deem every individual bit of cremains essential to preserving memories, which I found a bit ironic after so much energy and money and emotion had been spent, mostly directed at one man for doing something not totally dissimilar, abandoning remains unceremoniously. I guess what the living owe the dead, like so much else in this world, depends on the person and their feelings at any given moment. And maybe if enough time goes by, or enough healing, we owe the dead very little. In this case, the coroner didn't know what else to do with the 178 sets of deserted ashes, so they will probably stay in those unmarked mausoleums forever. The identities of the 100 bodies buried at this cemetery will probably remain unknown. Many years ago, the GBI put up notices on their website with descriptions of the unclaimed remains, and when I last checked, they were still up. So Greg still has unanswered questions about Tri-State, but when it comes to the question of why, he's formed a pretty coherent theory. When Ray Marsh became too sick to run the crematory, Brent was in college. You may remember how it was going to school. First time away from home, becoming your own person. It's a big deal, especially when you live in a small and tangled community where everyone knows your family. That can be smothering, and it comes with expectations. Maybe Brent didn't want to come home.
I think he got thrust into a business that he didn't want to be a part of. He was kind of like a lay coach here locally, for football teams and stuff like that. He loved being out in the community doing that. I think that was his passion, his love, not being involved with dead bodies and stuff. So I think it was kind of getting forced into a business that he didn't want to be in. I think part of that influence may have come from his mother.
During his time as head of the crematory, Ray Marsh employed his nephew, who helped mostly with the grave digging service. He was Brent's cousin, but 30 years older. And when he found out Brent was taking over the business, he quit. He said he didn't want to work for Brent, a guy so much younger than him.
So it was more than one guy could handle. And if something's got to, if you've got a funeral service that's due this afternoon, you get those chairs out there, you got to get that tent up, you got to get that hole dug, you got to get that vault set. What do you not have to do this afternoon? You don't have to burn that body. So he puts that off. Well, then tomorrow you got one. You've got a funeral service to do tomorrow. You got to dig that hole. You got to set that stuff. You got to move it from over here, get it over here. Well, I don't have time to start that thing and be there and run that. So I put it off. Well, wait a minute now. I've got to get this done. I've got to get something back to them. Well, I'll just send them this and they'll never know.
Brent's civil defense attorney, Stuart James, worked closely for years with McCracken Poston, the ringleader of the Marshes' legal affairs. While McCracken stands by his own theory that Brent was in a fog because of mercury poisoning, that he wasn't thinking clearly and he wasn't himself, Stuart seems to have a different theory on Brent. He agrees with Greg that Brent probably didn't want to take over his dad's crematory.
I mean, would you want to burn a body for a living? I wouldn't. But it was a family business, so it wasn't like he was not aware of what was going on in the business. Now, it is true that Dad got sick, and I can say generally, I don't know that he didn't want to come home. Was it a choice that he would make? No. He did it out of duty for family. It fell on him because he was the son. and Dad was sick, and he had to do what was best for his family.
Stuart and Greg both believe that family played a central role in what Brent did.
Did he encounter certain...
My producer, Johnny Kaufman, asked Stuart whether Brent ran into any problems or obstacles when he was put in charge of running the crematory. Maybe things his dad didn't have to deal with.
I can't answer that question. It's just confidential.
And here Stuart brings up a statement from a different attorney, a guy who represented more than 1,000 families in the lawsuits.
He suggested that what Brent did was not any ill will toward anybody, that it's sort of like being in your office. And he didn't quite say it this way, but I will paraphrase it in the way I understand it. You have your inbox, you have your outbox. And what happens is you fall behind and the inbox gets too full and you can't fill the outbox. And I will leave it at that.
The way I interpret what Stuart is saying is that running a crematory, maybe to someone who grew up with one on his property, can be a job just like any other. I've had jobs. Hell, everyone has had jobs where you fall behind, where you fall so far behind that you just can't catch up. And if burning bodies is your job, and you get backed up, well, maybe to you, it's just a full inbox. It's not the same as falling behind on your TPS reports, but it might feel that way to you. But just because you can twist and contort yourself into believing a scenario where what happened is somewhat understandable, that doesn't mean it's right. And Greg Ramey, for one, doesn't condone what Brent did by any stretch. That said, Greg's more sympathetic to Brent than I would have expected, considering all he put him through, as the central investigator on the case. Greg retired from the GBI in 2019. He still lives in Walker County. He spends his time building houses for his 2 sons. During his career, Greg worked sex crimes, murders, and child abuse cases. But the Tri-State Crematory case is probably the one he'll be remembered for.
Was his the crime of the century? Was this just well thought out scheme that, took a mastermind to figure out? No. I mean, he just a guy just didn't do his job, at the end of the day. Did he need to go to jail? Absolutely. Did he do some horrible, terrible things? Absolutely. Did he hurt and affect thousands of lives? Yes, absolutely. But at the end of the day, this guy wasn't a criminal mastermind set out to say, I've got this devious mind. Let me show you how I'm going to, screw Walker County and the rest of southeastern United States and make a name for myself. No, that wasn't that guy.
And that's probably why, even though Greg knows all the pain Brent caused, he isn't disturbed or angry when he sees him around town, which he does.
I have no hard feelings. My job was to do my job. I did it well, and I never made anything personal out of the cases. It was me doing my job. And unfortunately here, living in a community where you live and grow up at, sometimes you put friends in jail. Sometimes you put relatives in jail.
When you've seen Brent Marsh, do you guys say hello to each other?
If we're close enough to speak, we may. It's not, oh, hey, how you been? It's just, hi, how are you?
Just like anybody else from the community.
Just like, just friendly to anybody.
Even though he might not show it at the grocery store or wherever he might run into Brent, Greg still shares some of the frustration of the families. He's unhappy with Brent because he hasn't explained why he didn't burn the bodies and why he passed out fake cremains. To Greg, it means Brent hasn't fully atoned.
I think if Brent had come forward and said, hey, look, folks, I was trying to do my dad's business, but it was overwhelming. I didn't want to be in this business. This wasn't what I was interested in. I got forced into it. And it was just more than I could do, and I didn't know what to do. I was trying to preserve my family name, and I'm sorry. Let me tell you, folks will forgive you in a heartbeat down here in the South. I think the community still, kind of looks and said, well, you did it. We know you did it. You served time for it, but you never owned up. You never manned up,
Greg told me that there's a lesson from his grandfather that he carries with him. That you go to hell the same for lying as you do stealing and killing. To Greg, a Christian, it means that you might be able to get away with concealing the truth when you're on earth. But when you die, God will judge you. Brent Marsh is probably familiar with that same lesson. He's also a staunch Christian and a pastor at the tiny church in Noble founded by his ancestors. And that's where, one Sunday morning, I finally spoke with him. Somewhere in the archives of Stuart James, the civil defense attorney for Brent Marsh, there's a secret document. And in that document is the story, the full story, of what happened at Tri-State Crematory, which Brent told Stuart when he visited him in jail many years ago.
He went over the method and the madness of all of it with him, what his feelings were, why he did what he did, why he didn't do what he did, what happened, where the bodies were, where were they located. I asked for specific factual stuff, and I confirmed everything that I knew.
But even though Stuart told me about this document, he wouldn't give me a copy, or even tell me what's written on it.
Part of me would love to be able to tell his story. And I don't know what Brent would want to do if I asked him. And I said, do you want to tell your story? And we told him it was safe to do so. I don't know what he would want to do. I've never asked him that story, that thing. The only thing I can tell you is that it said, Brent, if your story has to be told, what are we going to do? And Brent would say, I have to rely on my lawyers to give me advice on that.
Stuart has a professional obligation to look out for Brent's best interests. And his on-the-record opinion is that what's best for his client is to keep secret the story on that document. The story of why it happened. Brent got out of prison in 2016, but his punishment hasn't ended. As part of the plea deal, he agreed to never profit in any way off of the crematory story. If he does do something like sell the movie rights or write a book and make money off it, he would have to pay the state of Georgia $8 million. That kind of penalty could make anyone a bit tight-lipped. Brent also agreed to serve 63 years probation, making for a total sentence of 75 years, essentially the rest of his life. In April 2023, Brent went before a judge who had the discretion to end Brent's probation. But despite his violation-free life since getting out of prison, the judge rejected Brent's request to end his probation due to the, quote, particular heinous, gruesome nature of this crime that has affected hundreds of people here in Walker County. McCracken plans to continue arguing for the end of Brent's probation every year until it's granted. I thought I might meet Brent the day of his probation hearing, but when it didn't go their way, McCracken decided it wasn't a good idea to introduce me to his client. And when it seemed like meeting Brent wasn't going to ever happen, in my last formal interview with McCracken, I asked him, straight up, on the record, why Brent had not agreed to it.
He has been absolute perfect citizen since his arrest. And I think he just doesn't want to stir it up.
And just for the record, the answers to any question to ask you is not going to make us angry or anything like that. But I'm just curious, did you advise him not to talk to us?
I actually told him, because we had just experienced what we experienced in trying to get his probation early terminated. I said, at this point, maybe it wouldn't hurt for people to know your story. And he was pretty resolute. And so I had to tell him, I respect that.
Do you think that it would do good for Brent to tell his story, to talk about what happened?
I don't know that it would. It'd be kind of nice for closure for him to do, but he's still on 75 years of probation. He's still working that off. And I would not want to bring the scrutiny and ire of somebody that's going to pop off and try to, he failed to check in. Let's nail him. Let's give him he's got 50 more years left. Let's bring him in. But I don't think it's time quite yet.
It's hard to tell if the Walker County community has moved on, but it's not like you drive through the county and see billboards about Tri-State. It's still the sleepy, not quite Mayberry it was back at the turn of the millennium. And with the abundant space and relatively cool temperatures in the foothills, it still seems like a nice place to live. After all is said and done, I don't think Brent has had a big long-term effect on the place. McCracken has maintained a relationship with the Marshes, even today. But lately he's turned his attention to that other big case of his, to the client who was accused of kidnapping his wife and murdering her, The Zenith Man. His book on that case came out in February, and it's a hell of a true crime story. Without a chance to interview Brent, there will always be gaps in the story of Tri-State Crematory. But with everything I've learned, I have a somewhat clear picture, in my head at least, of how it started. It's a rainy day in Noble in spring 1997. Brent's been running Tri-State for a few months. He's in the cramped crematory office, a body sitting nearby waiting to be burned. But Brent doesn't have time for that now. He's getting ready to head north for a funeral in Chattanooga, where he'll spend an hour in the rain setting up chairs and tents. As he's getting ready to leave, he gets a call from a funeral home. They've got another body for him to cremate, and all he can think is, shit. So he goes and sets up the funeral, getting soaked in the process. It takes longer than he expects because the ground is rocky and cold. Then he hops in his van, filthy, and picks up the new body, thinking all the way about how he misses school, playing football, going to classes, hanging out with friends, how he never really wanted this job, this life. When he gets back to the crematory building, he sits down alone, as usual. He's frustrated, holds his head in his hands, it's so bad. But when he lifts his head up, he sees a bag of concrete mix that he's using to build a little staircase at the house. And he thinks the same thing I've thought, and the same thing everyone has thought about some job at some point in their life. If they never know, then what's the difference? And that's how it starts. Or at least that's how I imagine it. And when he's arrested 5 years later, people want to know why. But he never tells them. The only explanation that ever makes sense to me has little to do with mercury poisoning. It has to do with family and legacy, protecting the ones you love. Brent couldn't do the crematory job on his own, and he didn't want to, but he kept putting on a show like he did, so the family business wouldn't die. And when he's caught, there's still family to protect. His sick father, his beloved mother, his sister, his wife, and now his 2-week-old baby girl. Maybe keeping his mouth shut is the best way to protect them. Maybe that's what allows his daughter to grow and thrive, to even attend an Ivy League school, despite being born into the crematory mess. I think the most likely explanation is that Brent is keeping his mouth shut for them. After a few years, the lawsuits mostly wrap up. It's a little complicated, but without admitting wrongdoing, the funeral homes settle with the families for a combined $36.5 million. For the families involved, there are tiers of payment. If your body is found and identified, you get more than someone whose body is never found. The part of the Marsh property where the crematory sits is put under a conservation easement. That means it's still private property belonging to the Marshes, but nothing can be built there. A crew comes out one day to demolish the crematory building and haul away the furnace. Stuart James is there.
It was the central symbol for why everything happened at the property. Everything about the whole thing was there. Did it work? Did it not work? Was it maintained? Was it not maintained? What was put in there? What was not put in there? If that retort hadn't been there, none of this would have happened.
The crew brings a backhoe, uses it to tear the building apart piece by piece. And as they work, Brent's mother, Clara Marsh, comes out of the house to see it happen.
She walked out and stood right by me watching it go down. And the conversation was something to the effect, well, this means this is finally over, because that symbol was gone. And I don't think she was sad about it. I think she was glad that she was getting closure to everything that was going on. And, my best guess is that she'll never talk about it, I don't think. I don't think she would ever talk about it. And I won't talk about her feelings in more detail than except to say that the best thing about it is if she can have closure, I think she's got as much closure as she can get on it.
And after everything, the Marsh family ends up shockingly well off financially. Their insurance company, Georgia Farm Bureau, is in a bind, needing to defend a client they don't want to defend. And in order to avoid potential liabilities from all the lawsuits, they negotiate a deal with the Marshes. The Marsh family absolves the Farm Bureau of claims from their homeowner's policy, covering the crematory suits. And in exchange, the insurance company pays $3 million for the Marshes' legal defense. The company also creates 2 separate trusts, one for Clara and one for Brent's children. The Marsh family keeps their homes and property and ends up with $400,000 in trust. They get paid. Where the Marsh name now stands is unclear to me. They've stayed in the land where people once rode go-karts and horses, where rays on the lake parties were legendary, and where teenagers danced deep into the night. The lake's been drained for a while now, but Clara still lives on the property, and so does Brent. And every Sunday, they go to the church founded by Brent's great-grandfather. Brent is now the pastor there.
Let's make a left, right?
Yeah. It's a Sunday morning in early 2024, and my producer Johnny Kaufman and I are driving to Noble, in the direction of New Home Baptist Church, where we hope to meet Brent Marsh and listen to him preach.
Do I need to say something?
Say how you're feeling.
Fucking so nervous. We've been talking about this for months, but the whole time I knew oh, well, that's something we'll do later. But now it's something we're doing now, and
they don't know we're coming. Nobody does.
Yeah.
We've been told by a friend of the family that the congregation of New Home is small and mostly made up of Marshes, almost like a family church. So it feels weird and a little wrong to be going. But we've also been told that anyone is welcome there, and it feels important to go. Because all this time I've vowed to show Brent's humanity, and it's hard without actually meeting him. I think this might be the only way left to do that. On our way to the church, we drive past the company that employs Gerald Cook, the gas man who first reported body parts on the Marsh property. We pass a funeral home that worked with the Marshes. We pass a cemetery. And we're in Noble now. We pull up to the small white church. There are a handful of cars in the lot already.
Okay, we're parked in the back of the church, by the woods and some grass. And I guess we're just gonna walk in. There's nobody outside. Greeting people, they probably already started.
We get out of the car and a woman named Joyce opens the church door. We say hi, but then we pause and ask to speak to someone in charge. She gives us a questioning look, as she should, and says she'll get the pastor. We wait in the entry room while she taps on the shoulder of a large man in a dark suit. I know immediately that it's Brent. He's older, but he looks the same as he did in the pictures from countless newspapers. Like the football player he used to be. Shaved head with a beard that now has some gray in it. We say good morning and tell him our names. He introduces himself and shakes our hands. We explain why we're there, that we're the journalists who he's heard about, the ones doing the podcast. He says we're welcome to attend the service, just don't record anything. Johnny takes his microphone bag back to the car, and we go into the sanctuary. There are about 7 people in the room doing Sunday school, mostly elderly adults. They all smile at us. Johnny and I, both white, stick out like sore thumbs. Clara Marsh is there. She's 92 years old. When she learns that we're journalists, she walks over to us, says she used to be a teacher, that she taught English for 40 years. We already know about her proud past, but we don't tell her that. The service begins a few minutes later, and more very smartly dressed people from Noble come in, until there are about 15 or 20 of us in the pews. Some of them are younger, even a few small kids who wander around the sanctuary, occasionally getting pulled up onto a friendly lap. New generations of Marshes, presumably. Brent is now 50 years old, half a lifetime from the young man he was when he made a tremendous mistake. He gets up to preach. He asked us not to record for the podcast, and so we don't. But one of his relatives made a recording of Brent delivering a sermon right after he got out of prison, right in the same room we're sitting in.
Hello. Hi, how you doing, bro? I think I've spoken to everybody here. I think I've hugged everybody here. I think I had a handshake with everybody here. But I want to talk to you for just a minute.
Brent asked everyone to turn to the 2nd chapter of Exodus.
And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out into his brethren.
He tells the congregation that today they're going to be talking about Moses. In this story, Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and Moses kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand to defend his people.
And when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses.
When Pharaoh finds out what Moses did, he vows to kill him. So Moses flees. In this story that begins with someone committing, I guess arguably a crime, and then burying the evidence, Brent finds a lesson, the ultimate lesson.
I just want y'all to understand that the Lord is going to put you in some situations. He's going to put you in some positions where you're not going to know exactly what you're going to do.
Sometimes God will put you in a tough spot, and it might not be clear what the right thing is to do. And Brent tells the New Home congregation that that's when it's important to take a step back, to wait for God's guidance, so you don't do anything rash, so you do what God would want you to do.
Is it something that God has put on your heart to do, then do it. But if it's something he has not put on your heart to do, don't skip ahead. Wait on his time. New Hope, wait on his time for everything that you do. New Hope, whatever you think you want to do it in his time. Because his time is like no one else's time. His time is always the right time.
I suspect that Brent Marsh is being earnest when he gives this sermon, but he may be pointing out the irony that he, of all people on this earth, needed to take a step back before he made that watershed decision all those years ago. Johnny and I stay for the whole service. Towards the end of it, Brent prays for us. Most of the congregation approaches us after and thanks us for coming, despite knowing that we're journalists and that we're telling a story about their family that they don't necessarily want told. One woman grabs my hand and says simply, "Tell the truth." And I think we have. And on our way out of the church, as we walk past Brent Marsh, he tells us to come back again anytime. Noble is a production of Waveland and Campside Media. Noble was reported and written by Johnny Kaufman and me, Shaun Raviv. Johnny Kaufman is our senior producer. Sierra Franco is our associate producer. Editing by Jason Hoke, Johnny Kaufman, and Matt Scher. Fact-checking by Kaylin Lynch. Sound design, mixing, scoring, and original music by Garrett Tiedemann. Our theme music is La Lucha es una sola by the band Esmerine. Campside Media's operations team is Doug Slaywin, David Eichler, Ashley Warren, Destiny Dingle, and Sabina Mara. Jason Hoke is the executive producer at Waveland. The executive producers at Campside Media are Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, Adam Hoff, and Matt Scher. Special thanks to Cynthia Marsh Harvey, author of the book Callie's Family, which holds invaluable information on the history of the Marshes, and Harold Michael Harvey for his video from New Home Baptist Church. We'd also like to thank McCracken Poston, Emily Roberts, Miranda Kaplan, Max Blau, Eric Juban, Zabe Bent, Stephanie Wharton, Julie Parker, Johnny Bass, Ron Cordova, Hugh Berryman, Joe Lehman, Brent Hendricks, Tim Mason, Beverly Foster, Dwayne Wilson, Bill Brown, James Bodiford, Elizabeth Cabraser, Dan Ronan, Roxanne Karimi, Rick Kennedy and Judy O'Neill of UCTV, the home of North Georgia, and all the gracious members of New Home Baptist Church in Noble, Georgia. Last, we'd like to acknowledge the families and memories of Ira Manis, Luther Mason, Ross Hall, Ron Hendricks, Bobby Crawford, Ray Marsh, and all those who were found at Tri-State Crematory, known and unknown.